All right, we'll go ahead and kick things off. Thank you all for joining. Today, we're going to talk about 5 ways that you can deploy AI across your tech stack, across your ops and finance processes. My name is Adam Reisfield on the product marketing team here at Parabola. And I've been at Parabola for 4.5 years. And over that time, built a couple thousands of workflows with a lot of brands that you probably know and love. And I've had the pleasure of instructing thousands of operators through Parabola University over the last couple of years. So, through a combination of that experience and dozens of interviews with operators over the last couple of months to really understand how they're deploying AI and where they are seeing value, I'm really excited to share some of those takeaways with you in today's conversation. So, hopefully, you walk away feeling like you know new ways and places to deploy AI across your business, but also feel equipped with the tools to actually start building these things without waiting on technical resources, getting stuck in a backlog, or feeling like you're in a position where the whole AI wave is happening while you're kind of in the backseat there. Now, what are we going to cover today? We got a whole lot, so I'm going to jump in very quickly. Just know I'll save about 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A at the end of this session. So feel free to use the chat to drop questions in as we go, and I'll do my best to hit on those at the very end of the session. Without further ado, let's get into our first topic here, the move away from formulas towards plain language. So, what's actually changing here? First and foremost, complexity that exists in your business, it's probably not going anywhere, right? If you have really complex processes that you've developed and fine tuned over years and years, those things probably aren't going away, but the time consuming nature and the error proneness and the lack of scalability, all of those things are things that can go away. And you can extract away a lot of this complexity. And I'll show you a couple examples of what this looks like in just a second. What we're seeing is ultimately not only are these processes getting simpler to manage, but also easier to understand and hand off, especially when teammates leave or you're getting new documentation or file formats from a given supplier. And it's also making it a lot easier to adapt as a business, right? If you want to bring on a new vendor, start working with a new carrier, you don't have these insanely complex formulas that you're migrating from one to another. And it just gives you a lot more flexibility and agility as a business, and also unlocks totally new capabilities that never before were possible, both from a combination of how time consuming they would have been and also how complex they are in nature. So let me give you a couple examples of what this looks like. First and foremost, we're seeing a lot of teams actually build workflows using AI agents to build on their behalf. And so, what this could look like, imagine you want to build a carrier scorecard. If you've ever done this manually, you know how time intensive it can take. We need to aggregate data from different sources, clean data, join it together. In this example, we're asking to standardize that data, combine a couple metrics, and then actually calculate things like total shipments, damage free rate, so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to jump into Parabola and show you what this looks like. If this is your first time seeing Parabola, the 30-second version is Parabola is an AI-enabled workflow builder that can really automate any work you're currently doing manually across emails, spreadsheets, PDFs, siloed systems, so on and so forth, to ultimately give you time back and document and automate a lot of your most manual, repetitive processes. So in this example, I'm just taking that prompt that we just walked through and pasting it right in here. And I also just added a little blurb about how we want to use plain language. Now, what Parabola is going to do is it's going to give us a plan for exactly how we're going to build this. It's going to understand what source data we're working with. And then it's actually going to add steps directly to the canvas. Unlike a ChatGPT that's just kind of going to give you advice, it's taking action here. And then it's going to say, hey, now that I've done this thing, would you like me to go ahead and calculate our first metric, total carriers per shipment? I said, let's do it. And this introduces a new kind of step, AI enabled, that I want to talk about. Some of the steps that we'll talk about today are AI enabled in the sense that they can do things like almost like making API calls to ChatGPT, if you will. So I'm saying, look at these carrier names, and then let's standardize them as UPS, as FedEx, so on and so forth. It's giving us those standardized values. We'll have some steps that are a bit more deterministic, or maybe I want to join together data based on a unique value, in this case, carrier. But we're also going to look at steps that are truly building logic to transform data based on plain language. So this is an example here of a custom transform step where I'm starting with 250 rows of data, and then I'm just saying, hey, I want to group this data by carrier name. For each carrier, I want to count the number of shipments, and I want to put that data into this column. And that's the exact output that we're getting here. Now, obviously, this is a pretty simple example that we're looking at, just doing a little bit of an aggregation. But what could this look like as business logic gets more complex? Here is an example where maybe we have a list of shipments and we want to understand for a specific shipment based on a handful of columns, is the SLA status within SLA? Did we breach? Is it pending? So on and so forth. Now, if you were going to manage this, let's say in Excel to support your carrier scorecard process, maybe you have a formula that looks something like this, right? If a column name changes, if you start getting data in a different format, if someone accidentally renames a tab in your sheet or someone has to hand off this process, this could break. You might end up spending an hour trying to fix this formula. And ultimately, this isn't the most scalable, flexible approach to handling this kind of logic. If we think about what the same thing could look like in plain language, now we're getting something that looks like this. It's really easy to just read and understand exactly what's happening. What is the criteria for each one of these statuses? And this is something that anyone on this call and any of your teammates could understand, iterate on, and just copy and paste if you start working with a new carrier and you want to deploy a similar process without needing to worry about syntax errors and migrating over spreadsheet complexity. Now, this is talking about something that maybe you're already doing today. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that complex, but it is nuanced business logic. But let's think about something on the more complex end of the spectrum. Now, let's imagine we get a parcel invoice. On our parcel invoice, the amount charged is based on the zone. And we actually want to figure out, is the zone accurate here? Is the distance between the origin and the destination actually lining up to the zone on this invoice line? Realistically, this kind of analysis is almost impossible for most brands. The scale is probably insane. And the formula might look something like this if you were doing this in Excel. And this assumes that you have columns for latitude and longitude already in your data set. Overall, not looking like a scalable or feasible process for most teams. If we think about the plain language approach to this, it's something like this. We're just asking for a new column called distance. We're saying, this is how we want you to calculate the number of miles. We can really easily use AI to look up the latitude and longitude for our different zip codes or just set up a simple reference sheet. And all of a sudden, in just a step, we can get all of those distances mapped out. So we actually have a new variable to audit our parcel invoices against to ultimately uncover cost savings, make the business more profitable, so on and so forth. That's plain language. There's a whole lot more that we can do here, but hopefully one of your takeaways here is these are things that you can build with no technical expertise. The only requirement is that you understand your processes and all of its nuances. And these are all things that are going to make your business more flexible, more adaptable to change, and put you in a better position to actually scale. Now, the second topic that we will talk about here, and if you're just joining, feel free to put questions in the chat as we go, is operationalizing unstructured data, historically really hard to work with. Now, for teams working with messy data, you probably already know messy data doesn't scale, right? It requires typically, historically, human hours to copy and paste data into different systems. A lot of times, let's say you're working with SKUs, a vendor might have their own format for working with SKUs, so you need to standardize and map that to your internal format. And ultimately, as a result, data capture is being minimized, right? If you don't have the hours in the day to actually do all of this data gathering from emails and attachments, which realistically isn't the highest value work, you're going to lose information across emails and attachments. And the shift that we're seeing today is an inbox is becoming a reliable, structured data source by having AI sit on top of our inbox and actually connect to all of the different systems in our stack. The way that we're seeing this play out is by having teams actually parse and standardize all that information that's coming from email bodies, PDFs, messy Excel files. And as you probably know, email is a primary data source form of communication for a lot of carriers, vendors, suppliers. So neglecting this data source comes with pretty large implications. The first example I'll show you here is how we can actually operationalize data within an email. So imagine you are a logistics company managing a freight order entry process where you might get an email that has the details of a shipment and carrier information in the body of an email. Historically, someone might need to open this email, copy and paste all this information from here to your TMS. Maybe they make a copy and paste mistake. Maybe there is a multi-hour long delay in between this process. And ultimately, you're going to spend hours and hours doing this at scale regardless. In Parabola, what this could look like is something like this, where here we have a workflow that is actually pulling in all of those order details, an email, we're mapping it to an internal format, and then maybe we're sending that data directly into your TMS, or it could do something like trigger a Slack message or actually generate a CSV file. What this looks like in this step is using AI to actually parse information directly from this email that came in by just explaining what fields we'd like to extract. So for our parsing settings, I'm going to say, hey, let's extract this data with AI. Parabola is automatically going to identify, okay, we're looking at a table with shipment details. And then it's automatically going to populate all those values that it thinks we're trying to extract from this document: PO number, shipper, so on and so forth. And now you can imagine when we're working with third parties, data is not going to be standardized from email to email. Every carrier is going to have a different format for how they're sharing this information. And so to do some of that fine tuning, we can do things like provide example values, or maybe we want to, for instance, provide instructions. Like for a contact name, maybe you want to find that in the footer of an email. Maybe we want to provide example values. These are all elements that we can layer onto our process to make it more flexible and help us really quickly go from unstructured data that we can't really do a whole lot with to data here that is really structured, one row of 22 columns that we then can operationalize in our process. We can join this with other data, we can reconcile it, we can push it into other systems, really do whatever you would normally do with that data manually, but then also go a step further by doing things that you'd never have the capacity to actually manage manually at scale. The second example I will show you here is digitizing and standardizing data coming off of messy PDFs. In this example, looking at a 3PL invoice, where maybe we want to parse some of those line items and store that data so that we have visibility into historical spend across our different 3PL partners. In this example, we're doing something very similar where we're pulling that PDF attachment directly from our email, and then we're storing that data in a Parabola table, which is like a really easy database to set up that lives in Parabola that can store millions and millions of rows of data. I often describe it as the easiest possible way to deploy a relational database at scale. Now, in this example, very similarly, we are pulling in that invoice, which I can see right here, a whole bunch of line items, quantity, price, amount, so on and so forth. And then we're just telling Parabola exactly what we would like to extract. Maybe we have our table auto-detected with invoice items. We can provide example values. And then we also have our keys down here. Maybe we want to provide some different examples of vendor names. And in doing this, since we're using an AI-driven approach, we're not, for instance, not tediously mapping, look in this section of the document for this value, this section of the document in this value. This is a flexible approach to document parsing, where even if the format changes slightly from carrier to carrier, we can handle that and process all that data in one workflow. Or we can even set up processes to parse multiple email attachment formats all in one workflow with AI to get really nuanced, precise parsing across all of our different invoice formats. Now that we've covered Excel, PDF and email body parsing, let's talk a little bit about how this ties into how you can actually increase your reporting granularity. Now, The status quo for a lot of companies that we work with, understandably, is let's go grab the big number at the bottom of the document, and that's what we are going to use for our reporting process. Yes, we would love more granularity into these line items, but realistically, no one has the hours in the day. That's not the best use of human capital. And so it ultimately gets neglected. All of these things make it really hard to audit your 3PL invoices, make sure that spend in one specific line item isn't exploding month over month because of an invoicing mistake on your 3PL's end. It makes it really hard to benchmark your fulfillment partners against each other to make sure you're getting the most competitive rates for all the different services that you are selecting. And it also makes it really difficult to actually map information to different GL accounts for a precise budgeting, forecasting, variance analysis, so on and so forth. We'll talk a little bit more as we go through this session. So, what could this look like if we said, hey, we want this to be more granular, more precise? Let's say we wanted to increase visibility across all of these different line item categories, and maybe in this example, order processing fees, packaging, returns, so on and so forth for our 3PL invoices. This is something else that AI is fantastic about, taking a nuanced approach to categorizing data. And we can do that really easily in Parabola using the categorize with AI step. What we're going to do in this example is tell Parabola we want to look at the description column, which again came right off of our PDF with all these line item descriptions. And we want to classify all of those into one of these categories: order processing fee, packaging, returns, so on and so forth. And if I click into any one of these, we're doing that same kind of fine tuning here as well. We're saying, hey, here are some example values that you might see for returns. This is a description, so it understands with a more nuanced lens how to actually classify this data. And then really quickly, we can see we've now classified all of our different 3PL invoice line items. Now, what do we actually do with that data, right? You can imagine over time, we're able to build a dashboard where we could visualize spend across all of these different buckets broken down by 3PL. So maybe we'd see one 3PL has astronomically higher return charges that we weren't aware of compared to some of our other 3PLs. And we also could export nice structured data where we can see for this vendor on this invoice, for this spend category, this was the actual amount of that charge to ultimately support more accurate, more granular financial reporting. Maybe this ties into our 3PL scorecards, so on and so forth. Now that we've ran through kind of how to take this reporting to the next level, let's talk a little bit about a related topic of rebalancing complexity. Now, when we say rebalancing complexity, complexity is always going to exist, but we can shift where it actually lives. And I think this is really about finding the sweet spot for both humans and AI to operate. And for AI, this is really going to be focused on what is the low value, repetitive work that might be impactful, but it doesn't need to be executed by a human because a human's level of knowledge, the nuance they can bring to a process isn't going to create a better result. That could look something like an inventory reconciliation, tracking shipments across different carriers and forwarders, work that's important, but doesn't need to be done by a human. Or on the flip side, there's also areas that we can increase complexity by having a human spend more time actually figuring out, okay, now that we have more bandwidth, now that we have more capabilities, we can use AI, where is it actually worth going deeper? These could be things like GL classification, auditing your freight invoices more effectively by getting into all of the surcharges and accessorial fees. Maybe we want to have a more comprehensive approach to scorecarding or something like landed cost analysis. And one example that comes to mind here, related to the examples that we've been talking about, is how we're actually tracking 3PL spend and mapping it to our GL accounts. Level one for this could be let's treat all 3PL spend as one expense type, right? Whether it comes from three different carriers, it's all going in third party logistics expenses. As you start to do budgeting and forecasting and take a more nuanced, precise approach to this, especially as you scale, you probably want to get more nuance. So you actually, when you do variance analysis, you're getting more insights from it and it's not all just grouped into one lump account. Level two for this might be okay, now we have more bandwidth. We actually can separate GL accounts based on the 3PL. And so now it's easier to benchmark but we're still not getting a ton of granularity into the actual categories of spend across all of those. Level three, now we're combining all these topics, right? We are breaking it out based on 3PL, and we're also breaking down expense accounts based on the actual cost category. So for Baja Fulfillment, we have multiple different GL accounts, allowing us to take a more nuanced approach to our actual expense tracking here. The last concept I'll hit on before we have some time for QA, feel free to drop questions in the chat, is going to be enriching documentation and process auditability with AI. Now, what does this look like? It looks like moving towards no longer having workflows and the actual documentation be decoupled. What do I mean by this? A lot of teams that we work with have a Google Doc and they have an Excel file. They spend, hours documenting that process in a Google Doc. 2 weeks later, that documentation's out of date. A vendor changed their format. Someone new joins the team. It's really hard for them to catch up to speed because there isn't a smooth handoff process, because there isn't up-to-date documentation. Ultimately makes it really hard to scale, be flexible, take on new vendors, so on and so forth. So teams are moving towards adopting live documentation and kind of on-demand prompting to actually make sense of processes and hand off some of the nuances and complexity. So what does this look like in practice? Let's look at an inventory reconciliation example here. We can see a few different layers of documentation happening here. There are cards that make it really easy for anyone to understand, okay, this is where we're combining data, this is where we're categorizing SKUs. But as I zoom in on any given step in the process, we can see we're also using AI to automatically document exactly what's happening step by step. So someone can read through what looks like a flow chart and all of these descriptions to understand all of those nuances of how data is ultimately being transformed. The other thing we can do here is if I click on this button in the top left, we now can start asking questions about our process and our data. So here I asked, explain how data is being cleaned and combined. Parabola is looking at our workflow, the steps, the settings, the data passing through, and ultimately providing an overview. This is how your data is being cleaned. This is how your data is being combined. This is what additional processing is happening. And now let's say something changes in my business and all of a sudden I need to start doing some filtering in the process as well. And I went ahead and added a new step in the process. Well, Parabola is automatically documenting that. And the next time I ask Parabola, hey, explain this process, it's going to capture that change. So my documentation is always live and staying up to date. The other thing we can do here is, let's say I've built out this workflow and now instead of fill in the blanks, I want that step name to be more descriptive. I could come in here and say, hey, name all of my steps so that they're more descriptive, put steps onto cards, make this a better documented process. It can do all of that in a matter of seconds. That is the 5 big topics we will be talking about today. I will hold on for 1 second to let any questions trickle into the chat. Otherwise, I'll give you about 30 examples of specific use cases where you can start deploying some of this AI and automation. Awesome. Well, if there are no questions, let me give you guys some specific use cases. First, starting on the operations and finance side of the house. We did get one question from Brianna. How often are you updating your AI models? Team is already updating with GPT-5. We try to always be using cutting edge models whenever you're moving from model to model. There's always some fine tuning. So I believe right now we are testing GPT-5 and iterating on some of our prompts behind the scenes, all to say we are updating these models as quickly as they're coming out, and have a lot of infrastructure to set up to test different models against each other so that, we're not asking operators, you test 5 models and figure out what's best for your business. We're doing that on our end so that you ultimately can work with the best possible models. We also had a question about use cases around creating cash flow forecasting. Definitely a use case that we see. I would say the hardest part that we usually see for something like cash flow forecasting is having a team walk in and say, hey, this is my process for how this is working today. Once we understand the existing process, it's quite easy to translate that existing process into a documented workflow. And then we also are seeing a lot of teams use these custom transform steps to create really complex logic and statistical analysis for doing some of that forecasting that would be really difficult to manage in formulas. Good question. Awesome. We'll hold on one more second for any other questions, but we'll jump into some use cases here. So, first on the operations and supply chain side of the house, kind of grouping into flow of the supply chain, have a whole bunch of use cases around sourcing and production, inbound logistics, ops and fulfillment. Think things that happen at scale. There are a lot of different data sources involved. There's a lot of complex, nuanced logic, things like inventory reconciliations, creating scorecards, auditing invoices, so on and so forth. We had one other question here about use cases for doing inventory demand forecasting. It's definitely something that we've supported. I would say a little bit more upstream, though. There are a lot of awesome tools for demand forecasting. The place that we really come in handy is aggregating all of the data that you need to support a forecast. So maybe we need to aggregate inventory and sales data across all your WMS systems, your sales channels. You need to combine it and do some amount of calculations to ultimately just have the starting place for your demand forecast. That's the most common use case we've seen. But we also do have teams similar to cash flow forecasting using those plain language steps to build complex calculation logic to ultimately support those forecasts. On the finance side of the house. We're also seeing a lot of processes across AR and AP processes. We have teams that have cut their time to close at the end of month in half by automating things like accrual calculations, cash reconciliations, journal entries, variance analysis. So, all to say, if you have processes that are manual, repetitive, involve mess happening at scale, these all make for great Parabola use cases. Now, I'll close us out here with a quick plug. If you've watched this today, you're interested to actually start building, you can get started at parabola.io with a free account. And if you're thinking, hey, I might actually know someone who this is super, super relevant for, you also can refer them our way and earn up to $2,000 if they end up becoming a customer. So, hopefully, a win win for everyone involved there. If you do have any questions based on everything we covered today, feel free to shoot me an email. My email is adam@parabola.io, or feel free to just reply to the email that you get after this session. Hope you all enjoyed learning about some new AI use cases today, and thank you very much for joining. Hope to see you at the next session. Thanks a lot.